Ladies and gentlemen, dear all guests and the academic staffs and all participants to this kindly event, you all welcome to the Science and Society meetings with the sixth one of the Istanbul Commerce University. Today we have very special guest from the India and the Indian government that we have already met with Professor Dr. Upendra Das at G20 summit in Antalya in 2015. Today, we will talk about the role of G20 on the transformation of globalization and the effects of pandemic into the issue. Before starting our conversation, let me invite the Professor Dr. Abdulhalim Zaim as the Vice Rector of our university, and he will make a welcoming speech. Please, Professor Dr. Abdulhalim Zaim.
Thank you very much. Hello to everybody, first of all. And again, I would like to welcome you and especially our respected Professor Upendra Das'ı for accepting our invitation and being here with us today. And at the same time, I would like to thank all the attendants for showing this presentation. I would like to say that this is, as Dr. Esal said previously, the sixth of our series of Istanbul Commerce University's Science and Society meetings. And four of them were face-to-face, but the last two was online. So I hope the next one will be again face-to-face after this pandemic procedures. So today, as Dr. Asal mentioned, our respected Professor Upendra Das'ı, who is head of the Center of Regional Trade New Delhi, will give us a speech about the G20 and pandemic relations. And again, I would like to thank him for accepting our invitation. And I'm not a specialist on this area, so I don't know the area very well, but the main principle of economics is providing enough supply for endless demands of human beings, as we all know. However, we all know again that the earth is generous enough to provide necessary resources for all of us, in fact. The problem is not the scarcity of the resources, but the problem is unequally sharing of those resources. This is why, in fact, governments, and especially G20, has an important role on equally sharing those resources to human beings so that we can live healthy and wealthy enough. This pandemic showed us again once more that people need each other more than enough, more than ever. So we should think about once more how we can equalize those resources among human beings. And people like Dr. Upendra Das, who is spending his whole life for providing those equality among people, show us how we can resolve these problems and go through this problematic situation and provide a better scenario afterwards, after this pandemic situation. And I hope that this pandemic will teach us all something, and we can realize ourselves better, and we can understand that we need each other more than ever. So I don't want to spend too much of your time because it is your topic and you are going to give us a better speech, of course. I would like to thank you, Professor Upendra Das, for accepting our invitation and giving us this speech. And at the same time, I hope this speech will generate important results. And thank you all for attending this activity. And especially again, Professor Upendra Das, for providing your time, and hope to see you all in Istanbul again, face-to-face. Thank you again.
And thank you very much, Mr. Vice Rector, Professor Zaim. It's very nice to get these hopefully things that we can also meet up in Istanbul to make an harbor Professor Upendra Das at our university. Thanks for your welcome speech and your contributions again. Okay, and now we can start our conversation by some Q&A parts, also some discussions about the current role of G20 in turbulent times, that we are now living different difficulties and deficits of international politics, whether they are reflections on economics and financial concerns, whatever you would like to add. But before doing this, we are lucky to get this chance from Professor Upendra Das, from also colleague and professor as the head of regional center. And also he are representing as a part of Indian government as the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, particularly the Department of Commerce as well. This is so important for us because we should understand these the global political economy concerns make their reflections both state concerns, both society, both economics. This is why today's speech will be so important for us, for all the participants that they are following up this event will be benefited from his ideas as well. Okay, I think we can start with your general overview of the COVID-19 pandemics and its reflections on global political economy concerns, Professor Ram. Then we can continue by some questions and the other sections, whatever you would like to do. Yes, please, stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ugul Asal, for this opportunity. I must thank Istanbul Commerce University and you for this initiative and this very important gesture to connect people and thoughts and ideas at the time of this very important crisis, which is spread globally. I must also place my thankfulness towards Professor Abdul Halim Zaim. You have very kindly spared your valuable time and initiated this discussion. We are very grateful to you for your kind words. And as you very rightly said, one day we will definitely meet in Istanbul to carry forward this discourse, this knowledge sharing. And also we would one day expect all of you, especially both of you, to be in Delhi and in India as well. So I hope someday we will meet in both sides and many other parts of the world in future. Now, the subject matter is so important in today's times. And I was also very happy that you have a series on science and society. And therefore, in this health crisis of the global COVID-19 pandemic, the issues of globalization and the role of G20 in the context of science and society also become very important. I would rather say that a multidisciplinary approach is required to solve various problems in the world, both economic and non-economic problems. This is what the present health crisis has highlighted more than any time else before. The pandemic, as highlighted by Dr. Asal and Professor Zaim, has only highlighted the imperatives of human beings connected ever more for human welfare. And this is something which is a great lesson of this pandemic. And the pandemic, of course, is a problem. There are problems associated with the pandemic itself. There are problems that are associated with other human behaviors also across the world. So what I will do in the context of G20, I will try and outline some broad threads of the problems and how I see a canvas of solutions which possibly G20 can take, along with the help of Think Tank 20, which is T20 of the G20, of which we have remained in part. And it was such a wonderful meeting, Dr. Asal, in Antalya 5 years back during the G20 summit when all the leaders were present. Now, today, I mean, of course, there is a tension between life and livelihood. On one hand, the health problems are risks to life. On the other hand, if you remain in lockdown, you have problems of economy not functioning. So there are problems of livelihood, people not being employed and not earning. So the trade-off between life and livelihood, and generally now people are understanding that life and livelihood will have to go together. While we are trying to tackle the pandemic, we also have to be economically active so that both lives can also be saved with physical distancing, wearing of mask and washing your hands, certain precautions and changes in human behavior. And with that precaution, we go and do our work so that economies do not slip into recession. Already there are estimates that the global trade and global economy would not do very well. But one bright spot is that one of the OECD estimates suggested that Turkey and India would be two G20 economies who would be doing relatively better than others. So I just thought I'll highlight that because that G20 and OECD, I mean, you have a lot of commonality. Now, one problem is this whole issue of life, finding the vaccine or a medicine for such a disease. And the other problem, as I said, is of livelihood. But there are other problems at the same time, which relates to, economic as well as non-economic domains. And that is where you feel that there are countries who have had trade wars, which is also translating into, conflicts of other kinds. You also feel that there is violence in different parts of the world, somehow doesn't stop. You also feel that there are political conflicts and countries tend to not agree to many things. And therefore, overall, if you feel, you will realize that overall, if you see, you will realize that there are various domains of problems relating to health and economy and political relations and the political economy, and challenges to the science itself and its bearing on the society and the well-being of lives. Lives, when I say, it is not human lives alone, apart from human beings, you have living beings. So the entire environment, the climate change issues, all that requires, collective action. And that's where G20 has to understand these much more rigorously and move forward. Now, there are other problems. I will not go into details, but a large canvas or the backdrop of the problem we are all aware that the world is grappling with. Let me offer the solution. How do we go about handling this? I will spend a little time on that. And if G20, along with T20, can take up some of those issues, that will be really a contribution to tackling some of the problems.
And dear professor, sorry for that, but can I just add a short question to your contributions on the role of G20? Could you please make a comparison between the G7 countries and the G20 countries, how they also reflected their policy responses and the executions to the COVID-19? If you could also make your comments, it will be make it more comprehensive as well. Thank you very much.
Sure. No, that's a very good question. Thank you, Dr. Russell, for that.
You are
I
welcome.
will come to that.
Okay.
So if you see, there is, if you see the human existence, you have an economic existence, a materialistic existence, which is very important by itself. Then you have a scientific existence, where science provides solutions to human existence. And through economic and science, you try to address various issues which afflict the humankind. And that's how a civilization moves forward from one stage to another stage. But you would have also realized during the times of pandemic that there is a limitation to science, because we do not know as yet, apart from the behavioral changes, any remedy in terms of medicine, a sure shot medicine or a vaccine. And human minds are working at it. We are very sure that very soon we will come out with a solution. But what I'm trying to say is that human efforts are required to address a particular problem, but there is a challenge which is actually also beyond human endeavors, and we must realize that. Now, if you come to the materialistic part, the economic part, you would find that economic prosperity, economic well-being, material, wealth is very important, because that gives you food, home, clothing, and other pursuits of life to live a decent living. It offers an opportunity to enhance your standard of living. But at the same time, you also find that only the material pursuit to life does not give you something else which everybody craves for. So you might have prospered and you might have material wealth, but very often we get the feeling that this is not all. There is much larger objective to human existence, which is happiness, which is peace. And that doesn't come about only by accumulation of material wealth. What I'm trying to say is that there is something beyond science. There is something beyond economics. And I don't know how to capture what is beyond science and what is economics. Maybe beyond science is nature. You can call it nature.
Yeah.
Maybe beyond economics, you call a value system. Maybe beyond science and materialism, you have spiritualism. Now, there can be different names to what is science plus and economics plus. And that plus can be nature. That plus can be value system or morality, moral principles. That plus can be called spirituality. Now, why am I highlighting this? I am an economist. My main core area of expertise is trade, international economics, economic development. Why do I say this? I say this because time and again, we have been witnessing trade practices that are unfair, economic policies that are hidden, the state does something in its own economy which is not based on market principles. Mm-hmm. There are markets that do not behave on market principles, but there are something else that actually govern markets. So what I'm trying to pinpoint is towards the ethical business practices, towards a role of state which is based on best practices, towards role of markets which is based on ethics of a kind where imperfections in markets do not cause miseries to people. Because if that was not so, we would not be confronted with a series of financial and economic global crises again and again.
Exactly. This was also a criticism to the 2008 global financial crisis. This made not humanitarian and all the results still challenging the international community, both in accordance with the peace and prosperity. I remember that we were at G20 summit with you in Antalya 2015, when the T20 summit has already held there, and we have mentioned the role of peace and prosperity collaboration and its reflections on the economy policies as well. And I did also follow up with you from 2015 up to now as the T20 works on the global political economy, mostly the role of how states can make cooperation rather than conflict, and how the states can coordinate their economic policies, mostly using the human central argument. And from this perspective, dear Professor Rem, I would like to ask you, how about the role of T20? I mean, how the T20 is reading all these changes around the world, and how they can make their policy responses to this situation. In addition, I just would like to ask a question. If we make another event in Istanbul by the leading of Istanbul Commerce University with the collaboration of T20, would you like to be with us again? We would be very pleased if you could do.
Well, that will be my honor, privilege, and pleasure
Thank you very much.
to be part of that. There is no question of not doing that. But as you reminded, you remember I had made an intervention, what I had coined a term called peace creating prosperity.
Yes.
And actually, you asked this question at the right time, because I was moving towards that paradigm that, the paradigm until now, which perhaps G20 should take to change, is something like this. Yes,
exactly.
Something like this, that we have the hypothesis that unless there is peace among nations, you cannot talk about prosperity and economic linkages and trade and investment linkages. First, you should have peace, and then we should talk about economic linkages. Now, I have been arguing at various places. I went to the UN Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC also, and I spoke about this, the peace creating prosperity. What is that concept? While the peace process anywhere is important, and that should continue and should be concluded as fast as possible between nations within a region or even internationally, what we should be doing simultaneously, we should engage economically. We should convert trade and investment as instruments of achieving peace. Now, what is the logic? How does this happen? It happens something like this. When you start economically connecting with nations, greater trade and investment activities and greater movement of people through trade in services, technology exchanges, best practices exchange, the overall level of economic activity actually goes up within the country and the countries or in the region. And when there is a level of activity going up, there are greater number of employment opportunities. Now, our endeavor should be enhance economic activity by using trade and investment as instruments, create a more diversified economic activity which results in greater economic opportunities for those to get employed. Now, what will happen? Because of this, a lot of people, especially the youth, which is engaged many times in violence because they are readily available as a reserve army of labor, they should have an alternative, fair and non-violent means to achieve their income. And once that happens, they will not be available for violent activities. And that is why I say that through prosperity linkages, through trade and investment linkages, when we create greater economic activity and employment opportunities, when more and more people start earning through their labor, through their skills, and the satisfaction that they derive from that, that will prompt them to go to another virtuous cycle of doing much better and earning higher income. And this brigade, this army of youth will not be available for something which is actually misused for violent activities. This is what I say, it is a peace creating prosperity proposition. Now, there can be one thing which needs to be highlighted, which is very important for T20 and G20 also. That when we do this, sometimes people think that this will create absence of respect for the military and security establishments. And I argue, no. Even in the times of peace, you will require expenditure on defense, military,
Yes.
security equipment. Say in your colony, if you have peaceful colony, even then you require lock and key and maybe CCTV surveillance and guards at the gate. So even in a peaceful atmosphere, you require the very important and respectable services of security and military establishments. Therefore, I argue that the paradigm of peace creating prosperity is a paradigm which means that absence of conflict does not mean less economic activity, less employment, less GDP growth. No. When you actually try to address conflict and go towards peace through economic means, at the same time, you can actually have a framework of very strong security systems. And therefore, the commercial implications of all these activities will only grow further. And this is something which can be tackled at the G20 and G7, that level only. And G20, in my view, would be a better format because already it accounts for, almost 80% of the global, economy and, the
Sure.
economic. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that this idea has to be taken up at the highest level of global intellect and action, where we combine the security systems, including non-traditional security threats, including cyber security and so on. We spend more on that. We respect that system much more. And absence of conflict doesn't mean anything, anything which people think may happen. And therefore, we need to have a paradigm where we should use economic instruments, we should use scientific discoveries for human welfare, ultimately leading to employment generation, because employment is an income with self-esteem. So yes, anti-poverty programs should be there, direct benefit transfers should be there, people should get money when they are required to be given. But when a person earns one's livelihood through hard work and one's own skill, even if the income is small, you get the self-esteem also. And it is that self-esteem that gives you satisfaction, that I have earned something in my life. That takes you to the spiritual path.
Mhm.
And therefore, we have to understand the human mind, that in human mind, if we create the moral principles combined with human weaknesses, because every human being has certain weaknesses, but if we combine the moral sentiments, moral principles in human beings to go for greater standard of living, but with certain moralistic principles as the basis, that gives the biggest satisfaction. And that spiritualism combined with materialism is the basis for conflict-less society. And towards that, our economic policy, our economic interdependence, our trade, foreign direct investment, trade in services, and scientific discoveries all should actually contribute to. All these also have important implications for the security establishment. The scientific research goes into security. The scientific research goes into the military, equipments. They also have economic, meaning. They have commercial meaning, and therefore, a positive relationship between economic and defense, between economic and peace, via the peace creating prosperity angle, where employment generation becomes the key when a person earns the livelihood along with the self-esteem, is perhaps going to tackle some of the problems that the world has been grappling with. This applies to the scientific discoveries even in the times of COVID-19. And unless, because if you see the global efforts, the point that you asked about G7 and G20, my answer is that G7 and G20 have not given adequate emphasis to solving this global problem as much they could have.
Yes, exactly.
Apart from the fact that they could have done much more to the Bretton Woods systems, the SDR and the related reforms, they have done at the national level. The G20 countries have done remarkably well at the national level, but G20 as a grouping has to do much more. And that is why I'm giving these solution, which is a very individual level, micro level solution, but it will have to be taken up at the macro level, at the level of G20. And that is where I see the role of T20.
And also, this is why the G20 Leaders Summit has already started at the end of 2008 global financial crisis. As we know, the current structure of the G20 has already launched itself at this year. But before this year's, that was on 1997 Asian financial crisis. And then the G20 finance and economy ministers started to get together annually and make some receipts for the international economic concerns. And here I have a question and how does the current crisis response by the G20 as an institutional compare with the role of the group during the global financial crisis more than 10 years ago? How do you see this change before 2008 to 2020?
Again, very good question, but you would recall, because you have been associated with this research and policy making process, in 2008, G20 actually played its real role. That time, the kind of directions and actions that percolated to the Bretton Woods institutions, and also the paradigm which got evolved to handle the crisis in terms of infusing liquidity, because liquidity was a major problem that time. That effort I have not seen to the same level as it should have been in the times of the pandemic. G20, it is, in fact, if I may say this, G20 rose to prominence in terms of its positive and effective role because of the aftermath of 2008 crisis, the way they handled the crisis.
It is exactly that. These are the criticism again, the role of institutional structure of G20, why they cannot still organize the permanent secretariat of G20. as we know, the OECD is backing up for the G7 countries. But here's a problem. That is also some discussions about the hegemonic actions, maybe why G7 countries would want to do this as an institutional one, because if they use this institutional structure, that they can be rebalance the international power balances between developing countries and developed countries. As you also know, as you also guess, what are the discussions about it? And from here, as we know, all the OEDs can also easily looked up that the India will be lead the G20 at 2022. And as we know, India is one of the fast growing country that's for GDP annually. And the projection for 2020 is around 7.4 percentages. And that was I think, am I wrong? You can change. That was in 2019, that was the 4.2 annual growth of India. That's still very good enough for all the averages, and it's above all them. And as we know, this year is Saudi Arabia is leading the G20, and they called this year term as the realizing opportunities of the 21st century for all. And how do you see the next years of the G20, and how your perspective from 2 years more that India will be lead, and how do you see the current situation, and how can India can contribute towards those global issues as well?
Thank you. India's commitment to G20 has been all along. And because today we are speaking about the global pandemic as well, you would have realized that Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, not only took the initiative of cooperation in the times of crisis with the SAARC countries in South Asia, he also took very active steps so that these matters are discussed at the level of G20. So that only shows that India is committed to G20. India is also looking at G20 to be inclusive, because, as you know, many say that G20, although they represent a majority of global economic prowess, they also have a very substantive share in global population, mainly because of India and China and other countries. But at the same time, a large part of the global configuration in terms of the number of countries, I mean, that is not represented in G20. Now, it is very important for G20 to work much greater frequency and at a larger scale when it comes to agenda setting in terms of global actions to tackle global problems on one hand, and also some of the problems that are very specific to certain continents or regions like Latin America and Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia. So it is very important that G20 utilizes its resources, its intellect, and its confidence in a manner that rest of G20 nations of the world feel connected with G20. This is very important.
Yes.
And therefore, the ideas which have to be taken up at the highest level of global policy making, G20 can do that. But then those ideas will be acceptable much easily if we take non-G20 countries also along. And already there are mechanisms, to address this. I think much more work would be required in the next few years in future.
And these are very good mentions, because as we are living nearly the same geography and all the problems that we are facing are mostly similar. And this is why the rising suns from the Asian countries, I mean, the developing ones that are trying to rebalance some unfortunate and some the they are not directly make some responses to current crisis. This is why this cooperation makes it more important than the guest. And from the point of here, I would like to ask you that, dear professor, as what should G20 do in the current situation, and how can it achieve those policy goals with your view?
The first and foremost is that G20 should understand that G20 really is meaningful and it matters to the world. I think G20 is not understanding that. So it's very important for G20 to understand and have faith in its, prowess. The second thing G20 should do is to meet more regularly and perhaps a little more frequently, because the world is afflicted with many problems. And as sometimes I said, that we envision a world, and when we talk of globalization, we define globalization as global actions for individual welfare and individual actions for global welfare. That is how the whole world becomes one family. When there is a global action which is for individual welfare at the microest level, and when individual action is for the global welfare.
Very
So,
nice.
yes, this blend of macro with the micro has to be understood by the G20. And this is something which we need to work more towards. And we should create an environment whereby G20 realizes this role. And in that, T20 has a large role to play to recommend and influence the policymakers, that G20 must take up the global problems and also regional problems. And many times there are economic and non-economic problems. They should be sorted out in a manner that ultimately what we are trying to achieve is peace and harmony, not only among human beings, but also between human beings and other living beings. In India, we feel that there is something which exists even in a stone. Now, it may not be a living being, but when you start looking at that no, this is part of the same universe, you may derive something out of a small stone as well. Now, therefore, this harmony, this message of harmony, that ultimately we should be at peace with ourselves, we should be peace as far as others are concerned, but we should also be at peace with other living beings, and we should also be at peace with whatever is a non-living being in a very scientific term.
Yes, thank you very much. And here, let me ask a question about the role of public authorities and their cooperation with the private enterprises. I mean, how the new era should reshape the relations between private sector and public authorities. Because as we know, in the economics literature, there are some discussions and projections about the 21st century and its conditions needs to make those relations more integrated. And I mean, the state should make some enterprises and make the economy more functional. And also all the enterprises, particularly SMEs, needs to support the development of state. That makes some Keynesian policies, new integration to the new era. How about your ideas about the changing role of public-private relations, mostly as an economic model, Professor?
See, if you see the history, you will find that you have successes of the state. You also have had successful market forces delivering what they should. At the same time, you have also seen that there are states that have failed, and you also have market failures. So you have today history of state and market successes, but also state failures along with market failures. Now, what is required is that you blend state and market, public and private, in a manner that states give full freedom and flexibility rather than fiscal and subsidy support. They should be giving ease of doing business to the businesses. They should be allowed to express their creativity. They should be allowed to organize their production, manufacturing, and their businesses with comfort. That is a policy regime that states must provide to private sector and business operations. At the same time, because the world is, the world business is conducted by human beings only, what you can do is you can have certain regulatory authorities created within your economy. So you give full freedom of expression of business to the private sector, and state should not intervene, but you should have a provision which is a residual provision that in case there is some malfunctioning found, there can be some intervention and some penalty by the state. So rather than trying to evaluate and assess everything that the private sector does, give them full freedom. And only where you find that not everyone, but any one or two are not following the rules, and if there is any malpractice, of course the state should have the authority to penalize that. So I think it will be a good mixture of freedom with regulation, if you may call it.
Yes, and thank you very much for your kind response on the question that I'm also particularly wondering about as an individual research as well. And here we have a question, dear Professor Rem. Let me ask from an audience that Furkan Terzi has already asked that India has announced 206 billion economic and package during pandemic. And what is the following economic plan for both inside India and international area? That's the question.
Okay. Yeah. So that so much was done for the domestic economy in the times of pandemic, and the large part of that package was actually focused on the marginalized and the poor sections of the economy or society in India. It also provided a special emphasis on doing business to the micro, small, and medium enterprises. It also infused provisions for greater liquidity in the banking system, for which both fiscal as well as monetary policies were used, so that credit availability to businesses was made easier. And like this, there have been many initiatives domestically, including free food and ration, etc., to the poorer sections of the society. Now, that is one. Second is, if you would have realized the recent pronouncements by India, India wants to engage with the world, and every country with the world of the world. But India does not want to be over dependent as far as imports are concerned. If there is some import, there is some critical raw material or an intermediate good or a capital good which has to be imported, which we cannot produce at all, fine. But what is being questioned is that we should not be over dependent on
Sure.
our supplies. At the same time, India is looking at an export oriented strategy whereby we want to supply products of good quality and low price to those countries where there is demand for such products. So the quality upgradation within our own country is a major focus. So my short answer is that India today looks at the global economy with renewed and much greater integration, but from the position of strength of its manufacturing, agriculture, and services sector, whereby we export to other countries. At the same time, as I said, if there is something which is very important to be imported, we just do not have, and we have to import, we cannot produce, or there is a critical raw material which is not available in India, that will be imported. But over dependence is something which perhaps everybody has to avoid.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think that the India has already did very successful of their development process in recent years that we are now facing, and seeing that the Indian government has also done very well. Lots of economic concerns and economic stimuluses as well to the industries, mostly focusing on agricultural and industrial production as well. And here we have nearly 5 minutes, dear Professor Rem. And the conversation is so nice, but I don't want to interrupt all the section. But here we have limited time, as I don't want to interrupt your daily program as well. And if you could also accept that you can inform us about your research Center for Regional Trade in the Ministry of Industry and the Commerce in Indian government, we will be very pleasured. As I personally know, when we had touched with the T20 Secretariat when we were at Antalya, and then followed up the issues by the leadership of 2016 China and 2017 Germany and 2018 when we were at also Buenos Aires, Argentina. That was the leading country, and unfortunately we couldn't be at Japanese leadership, but we hopefully be in Saudi Arabia. God will show, inshallah. And could you please inform us about your center, what you are doing now, and what those contributions can make to the global political economy studies as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ugur. When we had met, I was working with Research and Information System for Developing Countries, which is a think tank of the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India.
Yes.
I worked there for 27 years, and then Government of India wanted to establish a center for regional trade. And then, somehow I took up as head of the center, and I started alone. And today I have around 16, 17 of researchers and few of my administrative people. So we have a small institution of
Yes.
20-25 people, and we want to take it forward. What we do is we are an autonomous think tank. Our work is primarily technical on commerce and industrial policy, trade policy. So we focus on trade agreements, for instance, free trade agreements of India, and then analyze, the market access, tariff related issues, the rules of origin, non-tariff barriers, then trade in services, foreign direct investment, technology, sustainable development, and so on. So we provide research inputs to the government, but we also undertake independent research. We are very small and new, but now we are going to increase our activities of this kind. Perhaps we will connect with you also
Yes.
soon. Yes. And we are mandated to do collaborative research internationally and also nationally. And we would be building on this with greater collaboration in research, greater joint publications. There are various things which can happen. So the policies that we have in mind, for North America is different, for Latin America, Africa is different, Central Asia, Eurasia, West Europe, Turkey at the cusp of, Asia and Europe, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Northeast Asia, and Oceania, all the regions. When you look at these different regions, you feel that the policies, the needs, the scope of complementarities, the possibilities of being connected trade and investment wise and people to people contact is different across regions. That is why we specialize on, and we call it Center for Regional Trade. So that is the brief, and we have been here for the last 3 years, and we now are in a position to scale it up to a level where we will have a network of think tanks and individuals like you, and we would require everyone's support. And yes, we should be contributing to the global economic issues and trying to understand how the different non-economic aspects actually complicate some of the positive things, and we should keep championing the good, because I feel the real power comes from knowledge. The real power comes from humility. Something, what there is a saying in India, Vidya Dadati Vinayam, meaning knowledge brings humility.
Yeah.
So when we succeed, and because we are in the knowledge sector, when we succeed and we become even more humble, only to research more, create greater ideas, and contribute to coexistence of different beings and non-beings in this universe.
And also a special thank for this your approach on global concerns, because this is what we really need in the current era. That's pandemics, and COVID-19 also showed that need, and it's growing. And here we see, as also you mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, that was the main difference between the materialistic approach of mostly G7 countries, unfortunately, that they put themselves in front, most industrialized without human. But from the Eastern perspective, mostly India, Turkey, and the sons of this geography makes more human-centered, and the COVID-19 has also showed that the whole international community face this problem at the same time. But what they need is make the all sons as part of a global and more regional cooperation. That also helps us to grow our skills. Most regional countries can also balance off the any other attempts that the Westerns or capitalized countries would like to change all these politically and economically. This is why also we need to make more cooperation between Turkey and their neighborhood countries. This is why today we are very lucky to get your perspectives as part of a professor and the head of a research center from India, and the country will be lead the G20 in 2022. And here we have to conclude up our conversation, as the Istanbul Commerce University has made 6th of Science and Society meetings with the very kindly and very great contributions of my colleague, Professor Upendra Das from the India, as a part of head of Center for Regional Trade in the Department of Commerce at the Ministry of Industry and Commerce of India and Government of India. And let me also personally thank to you regarding to your busy program that you shared your time, your thoughts, your ideas, your projections about what gonna be we face in the next months of COVID-19, and how globalization has already made its reflections on the G20, and how G20 has already responded to this crisis, and what should be done more in the upcoming days that we will see. And let me give your concluding speech and remarks. Also, let me thanks to your colleagues as Center for Regional Trade that we already worked hard in a very short time. And I really wish to see all of them at Istanbul, at our campus as Istanbul Commerce University is centrally located in the Istanbul as well. And thank you again. And it's your concluding remarks, please.
Well, I must conclude by first of all thanking you, Dr. Ugur Asal. This is such a pleasant surprise to me because the day I received your email, it was after some time gap, and I was pleasantly surprised, and immediately I thought, we must do this, and I also remembered many of the discussions that we had during T20 and G20 stay
Yes.
at Antalya, and the discussions that we had with you and your other colleagues then were so fascinating, where I really felt that the way we think are quite similar, and G20 can become successful because of the like-mindedness of the grouping. And that will happen only when there are people like you in all the G20 members more and more, so that the collective effort of every individual culminates into something which is really worthwhile, where we have science, which is knowledge, we have prosperity, which is material, ultimately leading us to peace and tranquility and spirituality. And there is no conflict between absence of conflict and respect for security.
Yes.
So with that, I must thank you once again, and I look forward to remaining in touch, and perhaps we should be doing many things, many
Sure.
more collaborative work.
Sure. We are really wondered to do this together. And again, thank you very much, Professor Upendra Das, for your kindly contributions and very well comments on the current structure of G20 and its changing and transformation with the globalization and most particularly COVID-19. And also special thanks to your colleagues again, and hope to see you in Istanbul, whether we can also be in India. And very greetings from Istanbul to all Indian people. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. See you. See you.
See you. Bye-bye.